I have been working on this issue for some time, and it's very important, and the level of confusion out there seems just to grow week by week. So I think it's important to talk about it. I think one of the reasons that we don't talk about it as much as we should is because the issues are so intertwined with each other, and they go from things that are perfectly fine to talk to a 5-year-old about to something you wouldn't want to talk to a 25-year-old about. And that's one of the difficulties. So I'm going to try to keep it so nobody's getting too uncomfortable, but if I can't completely do that, sorry. I am not going into real depth. I was saying to somebody, we had a conference at the seminary 18 months ago that was a 3-day conference with 8 different hour-long talks, and we felt like we kind of got the grip on the thing. So what I can do in 40 minutes is clearly just kind of skim the surface. So what I tried to think about as I was preparing was, what do parents need to know? What do grandparents, what do aunts and uncles, what do teachers need to know as they encounter people who are having difficulty with gender issues? And I think the first thing that we need to know if we're Catholic is how do the basic principles of Catholic thought come into play in this, right? What is the Catholic mind on this? For any of you who aren't Catholic, I will now scandalize you. We claim that the Church is an expert in humanity. And that's, especially the last couple months, kind of hard to say in public, right? So if you're so expert, why don't you do it better? And that's a very fair reproach. When we say that the Church is an expert in humanity, though, we don't mean that any particular person in the Church is the complete be-all and end-all expert and knows everything that there is to know about humanity. What we mean is that we have spent 2,000 years thinking about what has been revealed to us about humanity, and also what the best human minds have been able to conclude to as they have applied their minds to the question of what is it to be a human being and what is the best human life. So when we have the audacity to claim that the Church is an expert, that's what we mean. We've been thinking about it for 2,000 years. So somebody who's been thinking about it for a year, that's great, and maybe you have something to add, but we're pretty confident that we've got some pretty serious points to offer. So, okay, my part is to begin by talking about how do we think about things with a Catholic mind, and that's the start of the handout. There are 4 basic philosophical commitments of the Catholic mind, and I owe this formulation to my husband, who was the first one to kind of say this in conversation with me, and we were both like, what did you just say? We got to write that down. That was really good. Okay, so here it is on my handout. Okay. And what's important about these principles, part of what needs to be understood, is that nobody needs to have faith to be confident in these principles. These are principles that are perfectly defensible on a purely rational level. And if anybody wants to take one of them up in the question and answer period, I'd be happy to demonstrate that. Okay? All of these rest on perfectly rational foundations and have never been proven false. But many people act as though they have been proven false. They haven't been. They've just been presumed to be false, right? Basically, without any good evidence. A lot of people don't want them to be true. Well, that's not enough to make them really not be true. Yeah. Okay, so the first principle is a creation metaphysics. And what that means is that we are convinced that reality itself is caused and ordered by a good God. That makes a big difference, right? If you are convicted about that, okay? And we are convinced that you don't have to check your brain at the door to believe that. If you bring your brain in the door and use it well, right, it can come to this conclusion. Many people hold this by faith, and that's fine, but that's not required to hold it. The second point is when we really get from Aristotle, a good pagan, right? And that is a hylomorphic anthropology. The idea that human beings are composed of form and matter, right? Matter, hele, form, morphe, hence hylomorphic. We are ensouled bodies, right? I am one thing which has these two different aspects which make each other possible. I am an ensouled body or an embodied spirit, right? Depending on your mood, right? Which one of those makes more sense to you. My body is as much me as my soul is. My body reveals reality to me. We believe that. Third, a realist epistemology. The human intellect is made to understand reality. Okay? We are not lost in this fog of we can't figure out what is true about anything, right? Okay, there are many people who feel that way, but they don't have to. That is not actually our existential condition, right? The human intellect is made to understand reality. And we believe, and I think we can argue, that the same God who made the material cosmos also made the human mind, and that they're made for each other. Now that idea also is, you'll find in Aristotle. He doesn't put God having the same kind of role that we understand God to have, but he definitely understands the mind and the world to be made for each other, right? And I think he's right? We have a lot of evidence that he's right. Fourth, objective ethics. Human beings are both rational and free. Those are our defining characteristics. We are able to use our minds to understand God's ordering of reality and our freedom to set ourselves in harmony with that order. And doing so is what our flourishing requires, and that's our dignity, right? Out of all creation, we're the ones who have the freedom to understand the order and to agree to it, right? That's a very different view of how reality works and what human beings are like than what we get presumed in quite a bit of the popular culture. And in particular, it's very different from the kind of self-invention that people are invited to by things like the gender unicorn, right? There he is on your handout. Who here has seen the gender unicorn before? Okay, so quite a few of you are familiar with it, but a lot of you aren't. Okay, this is all over the place, right? And what do you notice about the gender unicorn? What age group does he seem to be designed to appeal to? Very young kids, right? Okay. The gender unicorn is basically an invitation to each person, whatever their age is, to go through 5 different aspects of their life and to kind of put themselves on a scale, right? And to decide, well, where do I fall on that scale? And then they will come up with this unique picture of themselves and their own gender identity. Okay. The different things that we're supposed to think about with the gender unicorn, he's got this little red heart, the darker heart there. That's supposed to represent, who am I emotionally or romantically attracted to? Right? So first of all, emotionally and romantically, that's the same thing, right? Okay, sorry, Dad, that's a little weird, right? okay? There's this real kind of squishing things together that don't really belong together. And if you ask an 8-year-old, who are you romantically attracted to, right? The correct response from an 8-year-old would be, ooh, right? That's perfectly developmentally appropriate. But if we try to convince them, oh no, you have to answer that, right? Well, who knows what they would come up with, right? Okay. The orange heart, the other heart, is supposed to be about who you're sexually attracted to. Now, any 8-year-old, 10-year-old, maybe even 12-year-old who can answer that question, there's something really wrong there, right? It is not developmentally appropriate for a child before puberty to kind of think of themselves as being sexually attracted to someone else. There's a pretty serious problem there. Then we get this little genetic symbol, right, at the top of the unicorn's legs. That's the one part that any kid will get. That's your biological sex at birth, right? That one they're pretty clear about. Okay, the dots along the side of the unicorn, that's your gender expression, which largely means which gender stereotypes do you like the best, right? Do you think pink nail polish is really cool, right? Well, then that tells us this about your gender. Do you prefer, rough and tumble play to this other kind of play, right? So just look at these stereotypes and decide which of those you fit better, right? But those are stereotypes, right? We're not supposed to feel locked into those, right? But, okay. And then we have the rainbow in the mind, right? Which is this reference to gender identity, somebody's decision, basically, about what their gender is based on all of these other factors, okay? Part of what characterizes this is this drive toward, I have to decide these things about myself, as opposed to discovering something about myself, right? I have to decide these things. Instead of experiencing my life, my body, myself as something given, right, as a gift, it transforms it into, I have the burden of concocting it all for myself. And not only that, it's very fragmented, right? I got to think about the emotional, the romantic, the sexual, the nail polish, the this, right? It's a very complicated thing. Putting together that kind of fragmentation with the pressure you have to figure this out about yourself, right, is a formula for a whole lot of anxiety, right? And what do we see all around us? A lot of really anxious people. It's not at all surprising. The problem, though, is that what the culture does is it tells us to kind of double down on, well, look at yourself even more deeply, invent yourself better, right? Okay? As opposed to being able to take ourselves seriously as creatures, as something with a given nature, right? That we don't have to invent ourselves. We just need to receive who we really are. That's a much less stressful, I'd propose, way of thinking about things. Okay, so part of what's just kind of ironic in the current trends is we have these identities, right, and these names or these words. So LGBTIQWA, right? If you don't know, that's what we're supposed to be saying now, okay? L, G, and B all have to do with sexual attraction. Who am I attracted to? T is what we're going to talk about today. Q, I have not been able to figure out. So if somebody can explain that to me in a positive, life-giving way, I would love to hear it. And then there's I, right? Intersex. We're going to talk about that in a minute. W is for wondering, right? Q used to be for questioning, but now it's for something else. So now we have W for wondering, and A is for ally. Okay, so we're today going to talk about the T. But part of what's so confusing about that is that's a lot of different stuff lumped together. The whole question of sexual attraction is really very different from the question of what is my sex, right? Which is what the transgender person is asking. But they all get lumped in together. So it's a combination of the pressure of having all of these things here and fragmented in these ways, but also they're not distinguished from each other very well. So it just leads to a lot of confusion. All right, I want to talk a little bit about intersex condition because it has been confused in many people's minds with transgender, and it's a completely different reality, and it's very important for people to understand that. A person who has intersex condition has a biological condition in which their body is itself confused, right? There really is an objective confusion in the body itself. This is not something that's happening in their minds, okay? And I've listed here for you the three main conditions that get called intersex. There's Klinefelter syndrome. That is found in 0.2% of live births in the US. There's androgen insensitivity syndrome, which is even more rare, and then congenital adrenal hyperplasia, which is even more rare. But those are all things that happen to people, and then the body itself is confused, more or less, and then they have to contend with that. A lot of people with one of these syndromes, the effects are subtle enough that it's not recognized at birth that there is a confusion, right? It's pretty clear looking from the outside, okay, yeah, that's a boy or that's a girl. And things are clear enough visually that nobody really raises it as an issue. People with androgen insensitivity syndrome are biologically male, but there's a point mutation at the genetic level that causes the receptor for the androgen hormones to not be received by the cells. So the masculinizing that goes on in the cells of men never happens in this person. So you end up with somebody who looks like a woman, right? And often these people have, appear to be female at birth, are raised as female. Everybody thinks they just are female. But then something happens later in life, like their first pelvic exam, right, in their late teens, and lo and behold, they aren't female, right? And you do an internal exam and discover there are undescended testes, right? That you actually are a biological male. Now imagine how traumatic that would be. Okay, I was somewhere and a bishop came up to me and said that 25 years before, somebody had called him in a panic on a Friday night saying, "There's a wedding tomorrow and I just found a picture of the groom in high school and he was a girl. You have to stop the wedding." So he went and tried to find out what was going on, and this man had this syndrome and hadn't discovered that he was a man until he was about 18 years old. Right? And then spent the next 10 years seeking medical help to try to remedy that, and had gotten to the point where he was living fully as a man and was getting married as a man. Okay? So those things happen, and that's real. So if your friend calls and says, my grandchild is intersex, that doesn't mean that they've lost their minds and become transgender, right? That's a real thing. And sometimes those babies need to have a medical intervention immediately. The same kind of confusion that is causing confusion with the reproductive organs in babies can also be interfering with the elimination of waste, right? Either urine or feces. So for some of these kids, they have to have a surgical intervention to try to clear that up. And at that point, the question is, well, will it be easiest for this child to if we kind of go with female or with male, right? Okay. There are some intersex people now who are very much objecting to the idea of cosmetic surgery simply to get their organs to look like one sex or the other, right? They're saying medically necessary intervention is fine, but we don't think it's a good idea to do cosmetic surgery, right? Just for the purposes of kind of looking like everybody else. I think that's a very interesting discussion. Okay, that's a very different situation from the person who has gender dysphoria. Gender dysphoria means that there is a mismatch between the biological reality and somebody's subjective experience. Okay? It's very clear in the gender dysphoric person what their sex is. And if you do a karyotype, right, and pull out all the chromosomes and stuff, it's very clear. You've either got XX or you've got XY. And when you look at them physically, it's very clear which sex they are. The problem is that they don't feel comfortable with that sex, right? And they manifest, you know, I don't feel comfortable. There was a very interesting op-ed piece in the New York Times the weekend before last by a person who goes by the name Andrea Long Chu, talking about the surgery that Andrea is going to very soon have to cause herself to have a vagina, which she was not born with. That's a pretty radical surgery. And she writes in this about why she's doing this. She describes her own feeling of dysphoria, or his own feeling, right? Andrea's feeling of dysphoria. She describes in this way. She says, "It feels like being unable to get warm no matter how many layers you put on. It feels like hunger without appetite. It feels like getting on a plane to fly home, only to realize mid-flight that this is it. You are going to spend the rest of your life on an airplane. It feels like grieving. It feels like having nothing to grieve." That's real, right? What Andrea is experiencing. That's suffering. Nothing of what I'm saying is meant to convey that somehow Andrea should just get over it, right? This is real suffering that she has. The question is whether the best way to help Andrea is to assist her in causing these things to be done to her body. Since I was thinking in terms of talking to parents, right, there may be a few of you who have an Andrea in your family, and if people want to talk about that and share that experience in the Q&A, that'll be fine. But what I really wanted to get out on the table is what we need to understand about this issue as it's arising in children. Children often, right, manifest what we could call gender non-conforming behavior, okay? The little boy sees how everybody's so excited about his sister dancing around in her little tutu, and he decides he wants to have one too, right? That's gender non-conforming. Now, if we were doing a complete thing on this, we'd have to have a psychologist here to talk about normal childhood play and normal experimentation with stereotypes. That's just a normal part of childhood. Nothing for anybody to get particularly panicked about. Part of the problem that we have now is we are so isolated from each other. 50, 60 years ago, if a parent was worried about what her child was doing and started to wonder, gee, is she uncomfortable with being a girl? Is he uncomfortable with being a boy? They'd call their mother, right? Or their mother would be visiting, and they'd say, you see how Johnny's doing that? What do you think about that? And she would be able to say, oh, don't you remember when Uncle Herbert went through that phase, and that's just what he was doing, and we were all kind of like, oh, wow, okay, but we just sort of let it go, and he's fine, right? That's the conversation we would have had. Now, if a mom is concerned about her child, what does she do? She gets on the internet, and she looks up gender nonconformity, right? And she is terrified by what she finds. She panics, right? And a lot of bad things can go from there. If she is diligent in her internet search, right, and she's going to have to push pretty hard to find this, she will discover that right now there's a big debate between two different approaches to handling gender dysphoria, particularly in prepubescent children. The two approaches are the watchful waiting approach, where you don't make a big deal out of it, right? Yes, your purse is just as nice as mommy's, right? Okay, don't make a big deal out of it one way or the other, and just wait and see what happens. Okay, so there's one camp that says that if the child hasn't hit puberty, just let them do what they're doing, don't make a big deal out of it. The other camp says, no, if the child is really acting like they're uncomfortable with their gender, you owe it to the child to affirm that, right? This is fine. In fact, this is great, right? And we're going to have a party, right? This is all really just fine. We're totally accepting of this. Okay, how do you choose? Well, even the people who think, and if on the bibliography, I've given you this article by John Cantor, and this, Kenneth Zucker, right, is another MD writing about this. Both of them are perfectly fine with people transitioning later in their lives, right? So if either of these guys saw somebody who was 18 and who was convinced that they were in the wrong body, these are two men who would actually say, oh, okay, here, let's get you going. But they agree this should never be done with children. Okay, so the reason that is important is they are not on our side. It's not because they're wacko Catholics, right, that they think that children should not have these interventions. It's because they're scientists. They've been paying attention to what happens. And the data is very clear. Children who are before puberty, who go through a period of kind of this real gender nonconformity, 85 to 90% of them will be just fine by the time they hit their late teenage years. They will desist, is the lingo, if you just leave them alone. On the other hand, the kids who are affirmed, and everybody's like, wow, gee, this is so interesting. You are one of those rare and special people who is stuck in the wrong body, right? How many of them desist? 0. There is 100% persistence in the people who are affirmed. Okay? When the data shows us if they had been left alone, 85 to 90% of them would have stopped. Okay? To persist in gender dysphoria is to sign on, in this country, for a regimen of pubertal suppression, right? This started all the way back in 2007. Only for 10 years has this been happening, where people have said, well, if you've got a gender dysphoric kid, at age 11, we'll start giving him hormones or her hormones to suppress the natural puberty, because that would be too traumatic to go through puberty as their biological sex. The age for that now among some practitioners is down to 8. Okay. Then the next step is to give the hormones of the opposite sex so that you can go through puberty, right, but of the sex you think you are, not the sex that you are. That is a sterilizing process. A kid who goes through that becomes infertile. If they keep going, right, and a lot of times what happens is, gee, I'm still not happy, gee, I'm still not happy, well, I guess you haven't transformed yourself enough. The next step is top surgery. So for girls, that means removing the breast buds or removing the breasts. For men, that means some kind of enhancement. Okay, and that's regularly done by somebody who's 16. Right now, we're still pretty much holding the line at 18 for what we call bottom surgery, which is trying to take care of those organs. That is very dramatic, very violent, okay? Andrea Long-Chu says when she has this surgery, she will be left with what her body considers to be a wound. Her body will be constantly trying to heal up this wound that the surgeons have caused, right? And it'll be her job to be constantly undermining that healing process so she can keep that open. Okay. How can we justify this, right? In 2014, there were 24 gender clinics in the United States. 1 year later, there were 40. Now there are more than that. And now we have one of our own out at the Anschutz campus in Children's Hospital. It's the Children's Hospital Gender Clinic. How can that be justified, given that if we leave kids alone, most of the time they'll stop? The alleged connection to suicide is really the problem there. And this is one of the things people need to understand. Parents get told if you don't affirm your child in the gender that they think they are, they will commit suicide. And which would you rather have? The son you never knew you had, right? Or a dead child, right? What a position to be in, right? We would do all kinds of things in order to prevent that. That is using a study that comes out of Sweden, which is also on the bibliography. That's the Dejen C. et al. Long-term follow-up of transsexual people undergoing sex reassignment surgery, the Cohort study in Sweden. The reason Sweden is important is a couple things. They have universal health care, which is very standardized. So, this particular term about a particular procedure in this person, it's exactly the same thing as what this person has. Unlike in the United States, where words mean different things depending on different places that you're in. So it's very hard to make comparisons in the US. In Sweden, it's not hard at all. Everybody is not in the same healthcare system, so the records are all there, easily available. And Sweden is the most accepting country of these sorts of things on the planet, right? If you want to be somewhere where it's socially acceptable to change your gender, Sweden is the place you want to be. Okay, so they did this study of people who reported themselves to be the wrong gender, gender dysphoric, and who wanted to proceed with the transsexual surgery. What they found is before the surgery, these people were 19 times more likely to commit suicide than the general population. Okay, and that's the statistic that they're giving people to say, your kid is 19 times more likely to commit suicide than other people, so you better do this. Then the next step, because it's a longitudinal study, they show that for about 10 years after the surgery, their suicide rate goes down, not to the typical, but a lot closer to the typical suicide rate. And then after about 10 years, it goes right back up to 19 times higher than anybody else. Okay? That to me suggests that what these people are dealing with is a wound that didn't go away, right? That is still here, and now they're trying to deal with what's really an interior wound, right? And their bodies have been seriously maimed, and they are medicalized for the rest of their lives. If you go through this process and persist in it, you're on hormones for the rest of your life. You're visiting the surgeon to take care of what went wrong this week for the rest of your life. Okay? This is not for the faint of heart. Okay. So that's very important to understand if people start invoking suicide, and that is what very frequently happens in this country. Parents are pressured that you have to go along with this or your kid will commit suicide. The third feature of it that I think is important for people to be aware of, and which I find incredibly alarming, is the number of kids who are diagnosed with autism who are also then diagnosed as gender dysphoric. And this has been noticed in the literature, but for many of the people who are studying it, it's just kind of an interesting coincidence, right? They're not really pushing to, well, why would that be? Okay, and particularly what they're finding is this is very dangerous for autistic girls who are already a pretty small population. But because of their difficulty socially, it becomes very easy for people who are looking for these things to say, well, maybe your problem is that you're not only autistic, you're also actually a boy. Okay? Now, I'm not autistic, but one of my sisters who's a clinical psychologist says I am definitely diagnosable in some way. Okay. And I was miserable when I was 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, right? I was very miserable. And if somebody had said to me, you know, maybe the problem is you're trapped in the wrong body, I think I might have actually thought about that, because I hated girls. They all hated me, right? Florence Urbish had to tell me that everyone else had stopped wearing ankle socks 2 years ago, right? Just all this stuff. I felt so much more comfortable with boys, right? I'm very glad that this craziness wasn't around, because I think in my desperation I might have picked it up. Okay. So that's another thing to be aware of. There is this increasing diagnosis among kids who are not neurotypical, and that should be very concerning for all of us. Okay, so I need to stop. I have broken my promises to you. All right, the big thing for us is we are really committed to the idea that the soul and the body are one. On our view, and this is in the Catechism, it's 365, the soul is the form of the body. The soul is what makes my body be alive, be human, and also be female. It is impossible on our view for the soul and the body to somehow be mismatched, that I have the soul of a man inside of a woman's body. That is literally impossible on our view. Now, not everybody shares that view, but they haven't shown that ours is wrong, right? They just assume that what I am is a mind and my body is just this machine it's attached to. That's an assumption we've been making since Descartes first said it, right? But, you know, that was just 450 years ago? That's a new idea, right? We don't have to believe it's true. And I think we've got good reason to believe it's not true. Okay, so I've closed here with a couple of quotations, and I'll just point you to this one from Pope Francis in Amoris Laetitia. It's a paragraph where he's specifically talking about what he calls gender ideology. He says, "Let us not fall into the sin of trying to replace the Creator. We are creatures and not omnipotent. Creation is prior to us and must be received as a gift. At the same time, we are called to protect our humanity, and this means, in the first place, accepting it and respecting it as it was created." Thank you very much.